So we're going to look at neoclassical poetics, as I said on the course, before I started recording, and look at Corneille, Addison, and Johnson as representatives of neoclassicism and the neoclassical age. And neoclassicism, because we're studying English literature for the most part, we are going to focus on English poets, but really neoclassicism doesn't begin in England at all. It begins in France, in the Académie Française. And you'll notice here that from 1660 to 1780, it says, oops, reduce that again. You'll notice that that concurs roughly with the fall of Cromwell's Republican government. So when Milton finishes, the Renaissance period ends. And it goes from the Renaissance to neoclassicism. These are huge generalizations, but what happens is when Cromwell dies and there is nobody to succeed him, the Republic fails in England, and Charles II returns from exile. Charles II, whose father was executed, comes back to England, and he comes back with the thought world of the French and the Académie Française, and he brings that with him, and that influences then English writers and thinkers and so forth. So we're going to talk about England, but we're going to talk about the influence of France in England as much as anything here today. And so neoclassical poetics, let me say something about that then. It concerns, broadly speaking, now classical we've already looked at, right? We've looked at the classical era, or representatives thereof, Plato, Aristotle, Longinus, Horace, these writers, but chiefly the classical of all is Aristotle, and he is simply repeated to some degree, summarized by Horace, the classical author par excellence. And I threw Longinus on sublimity in there for reasons that will become clear when we come to the Romantics, because the Romantics talk about sublimity all the time. And yet their sublimity is different than the classical sublimity. And we're going to look at that in the next few classes. So we've done the classical legacy. We've talked about how the Christian faith transforms that in many ways, although it's engaging with it. Augustine in his On Christian Teaching is talking about the need for, remember in book 2, he talks about the need for the 7 liberal arts. In order to read scripture, you have to understand, you have to know grammar, logic, rhetoric, and things like number and astronomy and music. You have to understand those in order to read scripture even. So there is still a need, even for Christians, to engage with the substance of the classical authors. And then he gets to the teaching thereof. And then we've moved in more recent times into the Renaissance. And now we're going to conclude with neoclassicism. But as I say, the Renaissance ends in England when Milton dies, more or less. And then we move on to something different. And that's what we're going to call neoclassicism. Now, neoclassicism concerns the literary aspect of a broad movement in European culture and the arts. And it extends from, this period, you could even see early 17th century, but definitely late 17th century, all the way to the mid-18th century. 1798 is cited here because 1798 is the year in which the lyrical ballads are published by Wordsworth and Coleridge. So that's why they've thrown that number there. You have to have some numbers, right? So you stick, and that's why it's 1798. But you can see that there's Romantic authors writing even before 1798. And next time when I talk about Romantic poetics, I'm going to note that the beginning of Romanticism is earlier, and it's actually again in France, and it's in Germany in the writings of Rousseau. So I'm going to talk about Rousseau next time, and I'll talk about a man by the name of Herder, Herder. I do have a pen that works this time. I checked it. Yes. and Rousseau. But I'll talk about these two gentlemen next time and their influence. But these are the proto-romantics, as it were. Or even they are the romantics, but they're not called such. For English purposes, the romantic period begins right there. But the influence of these two on them is enormous. So there's very much of a European focus at this point. Although we're eventually going to talk about English letters, still there's a broad European scope here. And in the different European literary cultures, there's a diversity of opinions. And unlike the classical age, it's unclear who is the dominant figure. There are many significant figures. This is why it becomes more complicated in the 18th century and so forth. But in the wide, terms widely shared, neoclassical poetics is, first of all, a set of interests, a common set of interests. And they are deriving from an effort to imitate and to some degree reconstitute the literary values of ancient Greece and Rome, which will make you say, well, but that's the Renaissance, isn't it? The rebirth of classical learning. And the answer is yes, that's correct. I think that's true. But what I will say, and this is just a sidebar comment, but it's actually not without significance, is in the 17th century in England, there is the importance of Hebraicism should not be underestimated. And it often gets dropped out. There's a lot of emphasis on Greece and Rome and Greece and Rome and Greece and Rome. And we're going to find on the continent, German romanticism is obsessed with Greece. Not Rome, but Greece. And amongst the French, it will probably still be Rome. But in English-speaking countries, there's a huge interest in the Hebrew scriptures. And so much so that the first passengers on the Mayflower believed that they were going to found a new Jerusalem. And with them, they were reading Hebrew and understanding this as the foundational text of Western civilization. Not the Greeks, not the Romans, but the Old Testament. And with it, a certain politics, because in the 17th century, and I'm moving away from literary criticism here into political theory, there was a belief in that you can see this in the English Civil War and in the Constitution of the Republic in England, a belief that a republic is the God's ideal form of government, not a monarchy. They believe that in fact that Charles I was a tyrant who appealed to his divine right to rule, but they will read the Old Testament and say, actually, God did not want kings. He gave the people of Israel kings because they demanded it, but he warned the people that that hardship would ensue. And in fact, what he has argued is what he has desired rather for good governance is a republican form of governance. And that will influence United States politics and values from its beginnings, the 13 colonies and so forth. But it also is reflected in the English Civil War and in the Republican government of Cromwell. And this Hebraicism is so pronounced that Milton even writes in Hebrew. He writes poems in Hebrew. And it's very common in this day. So in addition to having facility in Latin and Greek, they also know Hebrew. And it's not just to engage with the scriptures, to be able to read God's word in its original, but also to derive broader significance from the Hebrew scriptures. And they have political implications, they believe. Anyway, I just say that because neoclassical poetics is going to move away from all that. The Hebraic contribution to Western culture is basically gone once the English Republic collapses. One final comment on that. In the medieval period, the Jews were treated terribly in Western Europe and expelled from various countries. Under Cromwell's government, the Jews were invited back to England. Ditto in the Netherlands, where the Netherlands became a sort of a hotbed for Jewish thought, now often atheistic, but still Jews were invited back into those countries, and Jews were also invited into the United States in many ways, because again, this sort of allegiance there, and it is to some degree theological, because the standard Christian take on the Jews is that the Jews killed Jesus, right? They're the one who, but the Reformation emphasis is that it wasn't, although the Jews were the instrument of killing Christ, it was my sins that held him there on the cross. It was my guilt that he paid for, it wasn't the Jews just victimizing him. His atonement had enduring significance, and it was for everyone's sins, past, present, and future, including us. And so there, with that in mind, the Jews are not then the Christ killer. I am. We all are, because our sins are being atoned for by Christ on the cross. So it's a very significant fact, I think. Anyway, I've moved away from neoclassical poetics, but it's not insignificant. And I can't get into it here, but if you want to read, there's a book written in 2012 called The Hebrew Republic, if you're American interested, or if you're even not American. The idea of the Hebrew Republic, the 17th century writers were, if you look that up, even on a Google search, you'll find stuff under this. There were manuscripts circulating in the day that were strongly arguing for a republican government, and as the form of Christian government, but based on the Old Testament and writings of that. So really interesting area of Christian thought, not as much explored as it probably ought to be. So let me go and get into it now. Ben Jonson, who's a contemporary of Shakespeare, the great dramatist, arguably the great dramatist of his day, but not the one we've seen as the great dramatist of his day. That was Shakespeare. Citing Horace, said that imitation, properly exercised, consists in assimilating the best of ancient poetic form and style to personal idiom. Quote, to draw forth out of the best and choicest flowers with the bee and turn all into honey. That's from his Timber. So he cites Horace, and he cites the pattern of imitation, this word mimesis that we've looked at already. Mimesis or imitation. There are certain words that keep cropping up over and over, and one of them is imitation. Imitation. Over and over and over. And you will see that the Romantics will also use the word imitation, and they will disparage it. So we're not to imitate. Whenever, like at certain points, there's a critical vocabulary being employed in-house that you have to understand what's meant by that. And what's meant by it is we're not going to follow neoclassical poetics at all. When Wordsworth says that we want to avoid imitation even, he's engaging with a long conversation that's gone on for a very long time. I'm coming to that in classes ahead. But Jonson, the classicist, says that properly exercised imitation means assimilating the best of the ancient poetic forms. Remember, I said there were 5 when we looked at the syllabus, and I talked about Horace. I also talked about the Hellenistic critics and their discussion of genre. It's their term as well, but also 5 classical genres. Jonson, the classicist, knows these genres, but doesn't say that we have to slavishly imitate the genre. Rather, we are to choose the best of those forms, so the classical works, the great books, and draw forth out of the best and choicest flowers with the bee and turn all into honey. So this is the purpose of neoclassical poetics, I'm going to say. And this concept developed into an adherence to classical ideas of decorum and genre. So decorum becomes very much a part of It is there in Horace, but it is also there in the neoclassical poetics. Decorum becomes the standard. The right way of putting things. There's a style that's appropriate to things to express them. If you ever want to read great style and see a classical author, read Ben Jonson's poetry. When I do 17th century poetry, I spend a very brief time looking at him. It's a quiet way of expressing deep emotion, restrained in some ways, but because it's restrained, it's even more powerful. Let me give it Johnson. I don't know if I give you one of these. On the death of his son, on my first son. Illustration of this. Can you turn that light off there so we can see? Thank you. Farewell, thou child of my right hand and joy. My sin was too much hope of thee, loved boy. 7 years thou wert lent to me, and I thee pay, exacted by thy fate on the just day. Oh, could I lose all, Father, now? For why will man lament the state he should envy? To have so soon scaped worlds and flesh's rage, and if no other misery, yet age. Rest in soft peace, and asked, say, here doth lie Ben Jonson, his best piece of poetry, for whose sake henceforth all his vows be such as what he loves may never like too much. He's lost a 7-year-old boy whom he loved, his right hand, his joy. What's his sin in loving his son too much? Why is he sad? His son has gone to be in a better place, the purpose of his life, the Ordo Amoris, he's gone to be with his God, and yet he's lamenting that. What is his sin? He's loving a boy that he ought to love, and he loves him so much that he is broken in grief, but he doesn't express it that way. Note how restrained it is, the decorum of the expression. And then even the idea of his son as his poetry, his creation, which he is in a sense. He's made in his image. But note how he's connected it now to his Christian faith and all of that. So it's just a wonderful illustration of decorum. We don't see this at all in our day. We see people howling in, their grief, tearing their clothes and, raging, going to counseling for ever to, overcome the loss of their beloved child. If you ever lost a child, you'd understand the grief. Many will. Johnson is restrained in his expression. There's a way of doing it. It's not stiff upper lip. He's not pretending there's no loss. He's acknowledging the loss and acknowledging the need to restrain himself and think rightly about it. Anyway, so it's just a great illustration of the point I'm trying to make here. So let me go back to this. So the ideas of decorum and genre, but there are various shadings of opinion. So Samuel Johnson, for example, another neoclassical critic, and much later than Johnson, Ben Jonson, 18th century, recommends caution on the grounds that a copy, that is an imitation, is almost always inferior to its model. So that's in The Rambler. I'm not looking at Samuel Johnson to any degree, but he is the great neoclassical critic of the 18th century. And he is, on the other hand, questioning imitation, because to imitate is to some degree to copy, and copies are always inferior to the original, which you will know yourselves. One of the consequences of a great writer or a great individual is people want to be like that person. And so they try to be like them. They go through the same, they even adopt the same tones in voice. I've heard preaching like this. Like there's a really great preacher, and then people under the influence of a great preacher try to do what that guy did, and they always come across as pale shadows and imitations of the individual. They just can't. They're not themselves. But it's not wrong to want to imitate somebody who does things well. In fact, we're commended to do that in Scripture. We're supposed to imitate Paul, and we're all supposed to imitate Jesus. So that, I think that's the crucial point here. Everyone is held up to the standard of Christ. You might be held up to the standard of John MacArthur. Don't follow John MacArthur. He was good at what he did, but better yet is Christ himself, and he would have said that, of course. Anyway, so the commendation of Ben Jonson is not contradicted, but the cautionary counterpoint to this is Samuel Johnson. But imitation deals with a very difficult challenge, and it's expressed to some degree in the big debate in the Académie Française des Anciens et des... Oops, got it wrong. I clicked on the wrong thing. There it is. Quarrel of the Ancients and the Moderns. And this is part of the Academy. Oops, that's not going to help blowing it up. The French Academy. It was a debate on where are the greatest writers to be found. Some wanted to go back to the ancients and use them as their models. Others said that the ancients are great. Nobody disputes the greatness of the ancients, not one writer that I know, even in this period. But they will say that there are things that are superior in modern culture to the ancient world. And there are even poets who seem superior to the ancients. And the chief of those is Shakespeare. Shakespeare, who clearly knows the ancients and yet does not slavishly follow them. So he will write comedies and tragedies and histories, and yet if you study, I'm teaching Shakespeare concurrently this semester with this, you'll find that he doesn't follow all of the features of a tragedy. He always ends it with the punishment of the malefactors. They're all dead. There's a restoration of order. Likewise in the comedies, there's always a marriage, even when it seems really forced, and literally is forced. Like in Measure for Measure, the Duke ends up marrying Isabella, and does Isabella have a choice in this? What does she think about the Duke? Doesn't matter. We need a marriage at this point. At that point, you move away from realism to a sort of an idealization of marriage as the way of producing a happy ending. But it's all Christological in both cases. Injustice will be punished and needs to be seen to be punished on stage to assert God's providential order. And likewise, good conduct is blessed with marriage and celebration and so forth. So Shakespeare is doing things as a Christian. What I find troubling in the response of this period is they never cite Shakespeare's Christianity. And this gets worse over the course of time. So that in the Romantics, where Shakespeare's literary star rises to its zenith, they basically see him as a poet of nature. It's also there in the Quarrel of the Ancients and the Modern. They see him as a natural genius, or even, they'll say this, and I'll delay the discussion of this till later, an original genius. The reason Shakespeare is so great is because he didn't imitate the ancients. He was himself. He followed his own nature. He didn't see others as persons, objects to be imitated. Rather, he decided he was going to express his own thoughts, feelings on the stage. And because of that, he exceeded the ancients. So Shakespeare then becomes the foremost example of the moderns in this quarrel of the ancients and the moderns. Now, the chief spokesman of the ancients is a French author by the name of Nicolas Boileau. Boileau loved the ancients and cited them repeatedly and commended them for modern poets. And for him, it's the test of time that makes masterpieces. It's not scholarly opinion, it's the test of time that shows us. And as he says, the worth of ancient authors from Greece and Rome is established by 20 centuries of universal admiration. That's true. He's correct. We can read Homer today like they did in his day 4 centuries ago and still admire him just as much. I teach with that same firm belief. I think that it's true. Homer is still a great author. So is Horace, so is Aristotle, so is Plato. These are all great authors, and I don't need to prove it, or the proof is everyone else agrees, and I can show you why it is so, and you also will agree. Better than our contemporaries. Whereas the moderns, on the other hand, is represented by another French author by the name of Perrault. So this is within the French Academy, this debate is happening. And they maintained that since the France of Louis XIV, the Sun King, the one who creates the Palace of Versailles. Have you seen the Palace of Versailles? Let me show you the grounds. And the famous Palace of Versailles, which is so significant for architecture and so forth. Let me go to images. There's got to be better images here. So there's the famous palace, but the grounds and the sight lines, there is the Garden of Versailles. This is what I want. Yeah, that's not so great. That's from the looking up on the palace. That's not so great. I want the other way. Where's the other way? That might be better. Is better, in fact. Still isn't it? If you are in the Palace of Versailles and you look out, you don't actually see the grounds, you see the horizon. You look into the sublime distance. It looks like you're a city on a hill, and there is no, you're up in the Ghats. You're looking out on what? Eternity. You're on Mount Olympus, effectively. It's constructed to illustrate a certain ideology is being projected here. Note that the order and the symmetry of the gardens, the rational ordering of things, the idea of the king at the center of everything. He's called the Sun King. And politically speaking, the age of enlightened absolutism. Perrault maintains that Louis XIV surpasses all other states in history in his political and religious perfection, and is per necessity, because of the king and the church and the union therein, per necessity superior to anything in the past centuries. So it is appealing to the Christian aspect of Louis XIV, is what he represents then. So of course he's superior to the Greeks and the ancients, because they don't have the true God. And so they argue for a new literature adapted to the modern era. And note this there. So, and then Richelieu comes in. I'll get into all that. I'm not going to get into all the French politics there. But this debate carries on in England as well. And if you want to read Swift's account of this, it's in a work called The Battle of the Books, which we don't read here, but you could read it. It's really basically the quarrel of the ancients and the moderns. So some advocating this, some advocating that. The Battle of the Books, Jonathan Swift, 18th century satirist. And I think I've summarized that to some degree. And the argument that is made by Boileau about the supremacy of the ancient depends upon a view that associates the ancients with common sense, nature, and rules, with natural law, with the enduring excellence that transcends space and time. That's implicit in this view. And Corneille, the writer that I had you read here, in his discussion of the three unities, is referring exactly to that. So Corneille is on the part of the ancients and sees in Aristotle's writing and discussion of tragedy, he says that there are three unities to be found in ancient works. And what are the three unities? What are the three unities? There you go, action, time, and place. Unity of action, unity of time, and university of place. So everything takes place within a 24-hour period in a specific place, and the action's all on the stage in front of you. That is the secret sauce that makes for great work. And we see it right there in Aristotle. He enunciates it for us. It's exemplified in the tragedy. So all of our tragedies ought to observe Aristotle's three unities. Note that Aristotle doesn't talk about this at all. It's gleaned from him by us. All the same. But the point is that Shakespeare doesn't follow the three unities. Take any of his plays, pretty much. And they don't take place over a 24-hour period. They have a plot and a subplot. They move all over the place sometimes, and sometimes there's a collapse of time in it. And so he doesn't observe the three unities, and that's what the critics will say. But Shakespeare doesn't observe the three unities that Corneille says are essential to great literary works. And one of the great and the response of this that Shakespeare breaks those three unities, one of the odd paradoxes of this is that the most conventional literary forms are the ones that are closest to nature, because they say, why is Shakespeare, what's the principle there if it's not the three unities? What's the principle if it's not the natural law? The principle is that he is closest to nature. So there's regularly then another type of dynamic that arises here, and it is the dynamic that between whereby Shakespeare represents nature, Shakespeare, and the ancients represent artifice or culture or a form of nature, where Shakespeare seems to break the forms and be more original. And so this dynamic between nature and artifice, ancient and modern, whereby Shakespeare becomes the representative of a type of poetics that breaks the hegemony of the ancient world, is all around the 18th century and into the Romantic periods. So much so that Shakespeare then becomes, for the Romantics, the chief author and influences the English education system thereafter. So in England, the Radio 4 popular series, Desert Island Discs, whereby they invite various personages onto the onto the radio, ask them to play their 6 favorite songs and then talk about them a little bit. And then at the end of it, they say, well, alongside the works of Shakespeare and the Bible, what other thing would you like to have on your desert island? But it's so much a part of English identity to believe that Shakespeare is something that you would want on your island that we don't even question it. We just throw it in and we throw the Bible in there. Now, I've heard atheists on there like Richard Dawkins say, I don't want the Bible on my desert island. Shakespeare I'll have, but not the Bible. So Shakespeare then becomes so much a part of English identity that it's unthinkable not to do Shakespeare, to include Shakespeare. And with Shakespeare, though, what do we mean by Shakespeare? Well, Shakespeare then becomes a representative of nature and to some degree of romantic poetics. This is where I'm going to go with this. He no longer is the Renaissance dramatist. He's no longer the Christian Renaissance dramatist that reorders tragedy and comedy in accordance with Christian theology. He becomes the poet of nature, just like the Romantics are. He's a proto-romantic, in other words. And that then becomes part of the English-speaking world's identity. So Shakespeare is a wax nose that gets pulled in whatever direction you want him to be at that point. And one of the reasons I teach Shakespeare and try and read him as a Christian author is to demonstrate that he isn't the way the Romantics portray him to be. They will also psychologize Shakespeare. So Shakespeare is a sort of a key author. What's really interesting, and to me rather horrifying, is that Shakespeare used to be a part of every high school education. He was there every year, and now he's dropping out, which was unthinkable 20 years ago. In California, he's banned from the curriculum altogether, which is rather extraordinary, because he's a dead white European male, all that sort of stuff. But yeah, okay, well, there's a lot of dead white European males. Okay, but we're not going to read any of them, and we're specifically not going to read Shakespeare. Well, why? Isn't that a strange thing? Well, that's a West Coast thing, and we can get into all that. But that's also creeping now into other countries. So Shakespeare's no longer the canonical author. Let me not get into all that stuff. The other thing that I need to mention, any comments or questions about that? I'm ranging rather widely here. But you know this, and Shakespeare will be cited specifically for this, and particularly for his devotion or his naturalness. He appealed to himself. He was the standard that he appealed to. His own originality, his own genius, his own self. That's what he expressed. He becomes the stereotypical self-interpreting orphan that the Romantics will present to the rest of us going forward. That's not Shakespeare, by the way, but that's their version of Shakespeare, which becomes so influential in the English-speaking world. But nature versus artifice, and from that period also, the word nature, oh, this is something I need to talk about as well, and I'm not, this word nature needs to be investigated very carefully by every person that engages with Western culture. You have to engage with this word nature. C.S. Lewis, in his study on words, studies in words. First entry is this one, and he writes 60 pages on it, and notes how the word nature changes over in usage over the course of time. It's not a biblical word, by the way. Or physis is in the New Testament. It's not there in, obviously, since it's a Greek word, it's not there in the Old Testament. And the corollary doesn't exist in the Hebraic mind. Nature, as we call it, it's a Stoic conception, actually. The Stoics are the first ones to use that natura. Yes.
Bearing in mind that nature does need to be defined.
Yes.
But do you think nature and culture always have to be opposed?
No, but the opposition is presented here, and I don't think so. Well, but I guess it depends on the outcome of our discussion here. But what I'm saying is they are opposed from the 18th century onwards, and we still live with that sense of their antithesis. So much so that we think that culture and artifice are contradictory to nature, and therefore desecrating nature. The Romantics are very strong in this. They see that human civilization is to some degree violating nature, and we're doing something wrong. Wordsworth is probably the strongest exponent of this in the English-speaking world. Rousseau will be in French. There's something about modern civilization that violates our own sanctity. And it comes from civilization. So civilization is seen at this point as something that is wrong and something that needs to be opposed. We need to go back to nature. We need to go back to our own nature. We need to resist the socialization. Society becomes the great enemy at this point, because nature is good, and what opposes nature is artifice. That creeps up so much into our thinking that, again, the whole organic food movement, natural, um, as opposed to artificial. Now, artificial food, as in, you know, plant-based meat, ugh, I probably think you ought to revolt against that. But the idea of, so I shouldn't have erased it, nature versus culture, what do we mean by that? Well, how do we deal with the cultural mandate then in Genesis 1:28? Be fruitful, multiply, fill, and subdue the earth. Exercise dominion over the created order. That's the command given to Adam and Eve in the garden. The cultural mandate, well, what does that mean? Does it mean that you obliterate nature? No, it means that you engage with it, that you perfect nature. You do agriculture. You do all forms of culture. What are you doing? Are you violating the natural, or are you engaging with the natural to make it more fruitful, more abundant? If you do any gardening, you'll find that actually you need to kill the weeds, or at least trim them back, and you need to prune your fruit trees, or even graft them. If you want apple trees, you want a better apple, we'll graft a branch from this apple tree into that, and you'll find you produce a new fruit. And guess what? It tastes a little bit better, lives a bit longer. You'll do the same thing with animals. You can interbreed them, and you actually get a more resistant, better yielding, better tasting, hardier, less disease resistant form of cattle. It's engaging with nature. You mean the nature that we shoot to kill and eat? Yes, that. You have to do that. In fact, if you don't cull nature, disease ensues, all sorts of other problems ensue. Now, these are discussions after the fall, because Adam and Eve are not eating meat originally, but after the fall they do. And they have to. It's not wrong for them to do so. They need to do so, in fact, in some ways. But they can't obliterate the herds. That would be wrong. That would be a violation of the natural. But this antithesis and the hostility there is ridiculous. You do have to cultivate nature. And it's not unnatural to do so, but it can be unnatural. So then what's the standard of violation? How do we know that we are desecrating nature? What do we mean by nature? What is the standard that we would use to determine whether something is desecrated or not? I said to you, we're going to talk about climate change on Monday. This will bear on that discussion. What's the purpose of human culture, human life? Is it to reduce our carbon footprints to nil? Extinction Rebellion type stuff? Is that what the purpose of it is? Well, if it is, if you think that the purpose of human life is to leave nature as natural as nature can be, because nature is good and we are evil, effectively. So we don't want to have babies. And that will be the best thing we can do. Well, what's sacred in that view? Well, the earth then, and nature for that matter. Is that actually a rational view? It's certainly not a Christian view. I think it's also an irrational view. All of these things come into the mix, though, but that is the, so now we've gone from literature to talk about practical application. But all of the terminology that we use to even discuss politics and science and cultivation and human life involve these basic terms that we need to understand rightly in order to navigate our way through this. But this is it. But from the 18th century, these are seen as oppositional. Shakespeare, in the Romantics, I'll call him the Romantics Shakespeare, as opposed to Shakespeare, becomes the representative of nature, and then neoclassicism is its opponent. It represents modern civilization. It represents the decadence of Louis XIV, the Sun King, and look at the Garden of Versailles. He is set above the rest of us. He doesn't see any connection between himself and the people. He rules. He says that he represents God, but he lets the people starve. Marie Antoinette says, When she hears they don't have any bread, she said, let them eat cake. She's never lacked bread or cake. I'm not sure if she meant it even seriously. She probably meant it rather to be witty. Oh, well, just eat cake if you don't have bread. They don't have either. French Revolution happens. In part, it's a revolt of nature against the culture and the culture of the Enlightenment rationality that was embedded in neoclassical ideas as well. And so we need to see some conjunction, based on what I just said about Louis XIV, some idea of the 17th and 18th century interest in science, because it reconceptualized nature as well from a metaphysical set of metaphysical laws, like Newton, the laws of nature, to physical processes of cause and effect. It moves from a metaphysical conception to more of a mechanistic. Nature then becomes a mechanical thing. And if you look at discussions of human nature in the 18th century, they talk about people as being basically types of machines. In Descartes' estimation, the substance of who we are is the race. Where did that word come up before? The res cogitans. He wrote in Latin before he wrote in French. So all the scholars of the day did. He wrote in Latin. He called the cogito, remember the cogito ergo sum, which everyone knows. I think, therefore I am. He called the thinking thing the res cogitans. And then he called the body the res extensa, the extension of that thinking thing. But his self then was presented in cognitive terms. It was a thinking thing. His mind, in other words, was himself. A disembodied, some people call it a ghost in a machine, characterizing his view. The res cogitans. Human nature is being reduced to cognition in response to his method of doubt. Because this is the conclusion of a discussion the discussion that precedes it. Descartes argues that he is so assailed by doubts that he's going to no longer seek to fight doubt, but use doubt as a method. He calls it the method of doubt. Remember, he writes discourse on method. There's a method that he's going to use. And it's the method of doubt. And he's going to doubt everything until he can't doubt anymore. And he doubts everything he perceives around him. He doubts the sky, that the sun circles around the earth. He doubts that. He doubts everything that he's ever been told. What can he not doubt? He can't doubt that he is doubting. He can't doubt if he's doubting, and if he's doubting, then he's thinking, and if he's thinking, then he exists. So this is a chain. Modern thought is not rooted in the cogito, but the dubito. I doubt, therefore I am. That's actually it. I think this is more accurate than the cogito. He doubts, therefore he is. He knows that he's doubting. It's an extreme skeptical position. You can go back and look at Descartes yourself. I'm summarizing. I'm giving my own take on it. My take is right. You question for yourself. Come back at me on I'm happy. I've read these for many years. The doubt is the foundation of modern thought, and skepticism thereby. And the cogito is actually is an expression of doubt. So you could say that the ancient or the Christian world is rooted in the credo, I believe, and modern post Descartes is I doubt. If you want to see the crux, pivot point, the attack on religiosity, the attack on natural law, see it right there in the conception of human nature as a doubting thing. If you want to be rational, you have to doubt everything. You have to question everything. Who is the best representative of the doubting thing? What sort of person? The orphan. Da, da, da. I don't know who my parents are. I have no authorities over me. I have no choice. I have to think for myself. Kant. What is enlightenment? What is the enlightenment? There you go. No, I'm not interested. For Kant, enlightenment, this is from his What is Enlightenment? It's a late document he writes. Humanity's emergence from a self-incurred state of immaturity, meaning inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. This immaturity is not due to a lack of intellect, but a lack of courage. Resolution to think for oneself. The motto of the Enlightenment, according to Kant, is sapere aude, dare to know. Have courage to use your own understanding. Don't appeal to your parents. Don't appeal to your church. Don't appeal to your culture. Don't appeal to the ancients. Appeal to your own spontaneous, original thinking. That's the model of the Enlightenment. Politically speaking, it's autonomy. Get rid of these people. No idea who they are. Just get rid of that. It becomes autonomy. This is the political word that's used over. Literally means self-law. I'm a law unto myself. I doubt everything. I don't doubt that I'm doubting. If I'm doubting, I'm thinking. If I'm thinking, I am. I am the fixed point around which the universe revolves. That orphan portrait that I've talked about then becomes the Enlightenment expression of human identity. And Shakespeare is presented as the poster boy of the beginning of the assertion of autonomy and originality and nature against culture. So it's it, and I think I've made the connections here for you. And I'm going to come back to this over and over and over again. Caspar David Friedrich, I have shown this to you before, and I'm going to, not that one, but that one. Wanderer above the mists. Yes, sir. This is the self-interpreting orphan. We don't even see his face. He doesn't have a face. Face doesn't matter. What's he looking at? Nature. Are we looking at him? No, we're looking at what he's looking at. What's he looking at? He's looking out into the distance, in the sublime background that this asserts his self-law. And note that he's on the top of a mountain. He represents his culture. This is the Übermensch as well, by the way. Although Nietzsche hasn't even written the work yet, but he's channeling an idea that already exists there. He's daring to be himself. The Übermensch is the man who dares to be as Kant called him to be. He is showing courage. Be yourself. This is a nature in which, note that what we see here is actually what we see. There's almost nothing to see. It's what we feel. That's who we are. Our feelings are the root of our identity. Yes? It's called The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. Caspar David Friedrich. I think it's 1820. Great painting, illustration of the sublime. I'll talk about the sublime. I'm about to get into that really heavy in the next few classes. Poetics shifts towards this position against the neoclassical poetics of the day. I'll have to say more about that when the time comes. I'm running short on time. Further comments, questions here on this? I'll spend a lot more time on this. But you can see that this is a fit portrait of human nature because it expresses the Cartesian sense of a self. It's a thinking thing. Well, what's the difference between thinking and feeling? Which is closer to nature? I'm going to get to this next class. Which is more intrinsic? Which is more central to human being? Is it thinking or is it feeling? Which one? Is it reason or is it feeling? The Enlightenment rationalists will say, following Descartes, in the rationalist tradition, will say it's thinking. The Romantics will say, no, it's not, it's feeling. Feeling is closer to our nature. Both of them are appealing to nature. The Enlightenment is closer to a Christian conception, by the way, but it's still a perversion of Christian thought. So for the Enlightenment, we are rational animals. I think that's Diderot's explanation in his Encyclopedia of the 18th century. The classical definition of human nature is there in Boethius and Augustine. And what is a person? By the way, the whole discussion of personhood is not discussed in this period at all. They don't talk about a person, even though they're talking about human nature. Well, why don't they talk about human nature in terms of person? Person is a theological term, an implication of divine personhood, the tripersonal nature of God. And we, by virtue of the fact that we bear the image of God, are therefore ipso facto persons. Because if God in his ultimate reality is personal, then we are persons. And therefore, whenever we want to talk about human nature, we must discuss persons. But this period doesn't talk about persons, and Descartes doesn't talk about persons. He talks about the thing about himself that is most intrinsic to his nature, which is the fact that he's doubting. Remember, it's just a method to establish certainty, and he's certain of the fact that he's doubting, therefore he's certain of his thinking, and therefore he's certain that he exists. But the discussion of personhood in Boethius, which will be the same, and the same thing is said in Augustine. A person is an individual substance of a rational nature. Oh no. Nature. Actually, each one of these words needs to be parsed out and explained. What do we mean by individual? What do we mean by substance? What do we mean by rational? What do we mean by nature? All of those are begged. Because all of those terms, because you could say individual is the same thing as Kant talks about with autonomy. The self, what's the difference between the self and the individual? An individual as a representative is the part of a species. Whereas for Kant, autonomy is wholly self-referential. You don't have to be a part of anything. You're a part of yourself. You're a unique, special snowflake. There's uniqueness in every individual. You don't have to answer to anybody. You are yourself. Whereas an individual in this sense has you as so there's one person, but they belong to the group of that we call people. So human nature more broadly, communally, is introduced there. Rational is a thing that we share in common with God, according to Boethius and Augustine and the Christian tradition. We have this ability that animals do not. Note that there's no reference to an animal. But by this point in the 18th century, we're moving into it's a proto-Darwinist conceptions of humanity as animals that have reason. They've developed reason. But what is their root nature? Because note that this is an adjective, and this is the root. We're animals that just have developed reason. Well, other animals could develop reason as well. In fact, they're going to evolve to do so. But at the end of the day, our nature is we are animals. Whereas here, reason is part of our very nature. So is our individuality. Personhood is what's being defined here. Well, person relates to other persons as well. So this is it sounds similar, but it's so different. Really interesting books I can refer to you on this as well, but yes.
So your realist has the Enlightenment definition.
I'm all over the place. Yeah.
Also, like, what was the romantic definition?
Of a person, they never discuss it.
No, of like, so like you said, the Enlightenment says irrational.
Rational animals. Well, no, they'll say that we're feeling animals. The strong emphasis of the Enlightenment or the Romantics is on feeling, and we, as in everybody after the Romantics who believes the Romantics are right, thereby believe that psychology is the queen of the sciences, because psychology is the discipline that looks into feelings. But it always begs the question, which you've probably heard me say before, in the study of psychology. It's a new science, by the way. Didn't exist in the 18th century even. What do we mean by psyche? Is it the race, cogitans? Is it the mind? Is it the soul? Is it what is the race? What is the psyche? Is it the soul? Is it the mind? Well, what is it? The ology means that it's a science. We're going to study it scientifically, where it has the status of an objective assertion about reality. But what is the nature of the psyche? Oh, there's another possibility. Modern psychology says, no, it's not the mind. That's too abstract. That's too enlightenment. It's not a metaphysical concept. It's the brain. That's what the study of psychology is. Actually, if you asked 100 psychologists what their discipline was about, you'd come up with 100 different answers, because there's no fixed definition for the whole study. They don't know what they mean. So how can it be a science is my question, without disparaging psychology. But it's a basic problem intrinsic to the study of psychology. Yes?
The definition of psyche is between the soul, mind, and spirit. The study of the brain would be knowledge.
But soul, mind, or spirit, that's not a very good definition. Right? I mean, it isn't a definition. It's like, let me throw as many phrases out that the academy will agree on so that they're all happy and we can all agree to play together and cooperate together. But those are radically different things. What they have in common is that they are not phenomenological. They're epiphenomenological. They're the things that do the thinking. Right? They're an immaterial object. Whereas the brain is a material object. So neurology, yeah, it deals with that. That's just they have carved that up as to cover their bases. It just begs questions. How can you think? How can a brain, a material object, think, which is a transcendental capacity that works in accordance with reasoning and so forth? It just can't. So when I think that I'm thinking, is it really just the neurons of my chemical nature firing so that I think I'm thinking, but I'm not actually thinking? And if that's the case, then how come I can do mathematics? Just begs so many. Just say it's a huge mess, all caused by a problem of human nature, which emerges in this period and then infects the whole of the humanities. I say, I apologize for being all over the place, but they go all over the place. I'm just tracking them a little bit, just trying to give the problem of human nature becomes the chief problem of in literature, but also every other discipline. And they're so dissatisfied, or they see the obstacle of theology in this to be so prominent, they throw theology out of the university in the 19th century. It's gone. You can do religious studies, but you can't do theology. Theology is the queen of the sciences. Not anymore. She's out. Okay, well, then you can do her in a seminary or a Bible college. You can study theology. Yes, you can, but then the queen has no subjects anymore. It doesn't have the 7 liberal arts, the very things that you need in order to read the Bible. You don't have any knowledge of those things. So you and I are living in an age where it's basically a big flaming dumpster fire. But recovering a sense of personhood is really important for you, not a practical, utmost practical. And I would say even in terms of counseling, if you want to fix somebody's problems, you can't. What are they thinking about themselves? Who do they think they are? How do they understand their identity? Is it as a person? Is it in relation to God? Or is it a self-relational thing? That's a deeply, like, if you can't fix that, then you end up repeating the same errors over and over and over. Anyway, we're done for now. Thank you. I'm going to come back to this picture and say a lot more about it.